Elias McKenna, sweating in the cool morning air, waits at the altar, forced to marry a stranger to save his ranch. The air should have been sharp enough to keep him steady, but the bead of sweat crawling down his temple told another story. He'd handled wild mustangs, faced blizzards that turned the prairie to white silence, and buried friends who'd never made it through a hard winter. But nothing had prepared him for this. It was the summer of 1874, and the Wyoming Territory lay under a sky so wide and dry it could swallow a man whole. The little wooden church smelled of pine pitch and dust, its timbers creaking softly as the wind outside whispered across the plains. Through the open windows came the faint rattle of grass and the distant lowing of cattle, a reminder that the land, his land, waited beyond these walls, parched and desperate for the water he could no longer afford. Neighbors filled the pews in Sunday best, their eyes shifting between politeness and quiet judgment. Some had pity in their faces, others the thin smile of curiosity, as though they'd come to watch the final act of a play. Elias stood tall, late 30s, broad through the shoulders, his skin weathered by years of branding, fencing, and long rides under the high sun. He was a man of work, not ceremony, but the drought and his father's debts had backed him into this corner. The hush deepened when the bride stepped into the aisle. Clara Dawson moved with a slow, measured grace, her simple dress brushing the floorboards. She was not the timid young bride he'd imagined in the restless hours leading up to this day. She was fuller in form, her round face framed by dark hair pulled neatly back, her chin lifted in a way that made her seem taller than she was. And then there were her eyes, steady, unblinking, carrying something he couldn't name. They didn't dart away shyly. They met his like a challenge. In that moment, a flicker of unease passed through him. She wasn't here as a pawn or a victim. No, she had come with purpose. Elias realized with a tightening in his chest that Clara Dawson might already know more about him than he knew about her. Something in her look told him she held a piece of the game he hadn't even realized they were playing. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe Dust and Destiny now and ride with us to the very end. The church bells were still echoing faintly in Elias's ears when he climbed onto the wagon seat beside Clara. The creak of the wooden frame and the rhythmic clop of the team's hooves filled the space between them. The Wyoming wind swept over the open road, carrying the dry scent of sunburnt grass and the faint tang of distant pine. Elias kept his eyes ahead, his hands steady on the reins. He didn't know what to say to this woman who had just become his wife by law, if not by choice. "You'll want to see the house first," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I've already seen it," Clara replied without looking at him. 3 times, in fact. Once in spring, twice this summer. He turned sharply toward her. "How would you—" "While you were in town," she cut in, "drinking your worries over this marriage and pretending the drought was your only problem." Elias's jaw tightened. "That's a bold thing to say to a man you just married." "It's bolder to let your ranch rot under your boots and not do a thing about it," she said, her tone level, not mocking. "You've got more trouble than dry grass, Elias McKenna. Your foreman, Silas Gage, he's been skimming your cattle sales for nearly a year. 15 head a month, sometimes more. Reports fewer to market, pockets the difference." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Silas? He's been with me for 12 years. I'd trust him with my life." Clara finally turned to meet his gaze, and there was no softness in her eyes. "That's the problem. Loyalty's a fine thing, but it doesn't pay off a man's gambling debts. Silas owes money to men you don't want riding through your gates." The reins felt heavier in Elias's grip. "If this is some story your father told you—" "This isn't from my father," she said sharply. "It's from watching and listening and keeping my ears open in places you don't think a woman goes. Your debts are more than the bank's. Your father owes money all over this territory. Some of it to men who'd see this ranch burn before they let it change hands. And they've been circling, Elias, waiting for the right moment to take it all." The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, the horizon wavering in the heat. Elias stared at it, trying to shove her words aside, but they stuck like burrs in his mind. His father had been evasive lately, always gone on business, and now that he thought of it, the herd had been thinning in ways he'd blamed on rustlers. "You think you can ride in here," he said, his voice low, "and tell me my business? You've been my wife for all of an hour." "I think," Clara said evenly, "that I just married into a fight you don't realize you're already losing. And if you want to keep breathing, you'd best start treating me like someone who can help you win it." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw no fear in her face, only a clear-eyed certainty that unsettled him more than any threat. "You've got a choice, Elias," she said finally, her voice as sharp and cold as a drawn blade. "Decide fast whether you want a partner or a grave marker." The wagon rattled on toward the ranch, and though Elias said nothing more, he could feel the ground shifting under him. Whatever this marriage was, it wasn't going to be quiet. By the time the wagon rattled into the yard, the sun was leaning west, turning the sky the color of pale brass. Elias climbed down, unhitched the team, and let the barn door swallow them in shadow. When he stepped into the main house, the place felt different, quieter, but not in the easy way of an empty room. He found her in his office. Clara stood behind his desk as though she'd always belonged there, the late light catching the faint dust in the air and glinting off the brass corners of the ledger she was paging through. She didn't glance up when he stepped in, didn't ask permission. The rows of numbers and dates lay open before her like a trail of tracks across snow, and from the tight set of her jaw, she was already following them. Before Elias could speak, the doorframe filled with a broad shadow. Silas Gage stepped in, his hat low over his eyes, the brim casting his weathered face into half-dark. "Boss," he said slowly, "wasn't expecting to see her in here." Clara closed the ledger with a soft thump. "Then maybe you should start expecting more things you don't like." Elias caught the flicker in Silas's expression, a tightening around the mouth, a quick glance toward the shelves where more account books rested. The air thickened with something unsaid. Elias didn't push it, not yet. "Clara," he said, keeping his tone even. "Come on, let's take a look at the south pasture before the light's gone." She didn't hesitate, just moved past Silas with a faint brush of skirts, leaving the scent of sun-warmed cotton and paper ink behind. Elias followed her outside. They walked the fence line in a slow rhythm, boots crunching dry grass. The sky above them was a high, unbroken vault, and the land stretched for miles, brittle and gold in the fading day. Conversation came in fits, but the silences between were heavier than words. "You've kept the North Ridge clear," Clara said finally, scanning the far hills. "Always have. Winter snows pile deep there. Cattle need room to move down." She nodded, almost to herself. "I remember that." Elias frowned. "Remember?" Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "I heard my father talking about it once, years back. He said you were stubborn about the ridge, even when other ranchers sold theirs off." She glanced at him then, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "Said it was the only smart thing you'd done that year." He felt the heat rise in his neck. "So, you've been hearing about me a while." "I saw you once," she admitted, her voice quieter now, "from the porch at Dawson Creek. You were driving cattle past the South Road. I was 14, maybe 15. My father told me to get back inside." "And you did?" he asked, half skeptical. Her smile turned faintly rueful. "Not right away." They reached the far post, where the fence dipped toward a shallow wash. Clara stopped, resting a gloved hand on the weathered wood. "Elias, you think this marriage was your father's doing alone? But some unions are years in the making. You just don't see the threads until they're tied." There was a weight in her words that made him study her face. She wasn't just speaking of family deals or land trades. Somewhere beneath her calm, there was a story, one he wasn't sure he wanted to hear yet. The wind carried the distant sound of a bell from the barn, Silas calling in the hands for supper. Elias straightened, nodding toward the trail back. "We'd best head in." As they turned, Clara's eyes lingered on the dry stretch of creek bed that cut across the pasture, and he could almost feel her measuring it, the way she'd measured him in the church. He had the uneasy sense that she knew exactly where this land's strength lay, and its weakest point. And for the first time that day, Elias wondered if Clara Dawson had been walking toward this marriage for far longer than he'd been running from it. By the time the supper bell had faded, the house was quiet except for the faint hiss of the oil lamp in Elias's office. He'd been sorting through paperwork, half trying to convince himself Clara's warnings were exaggerated, when a muffled voice in the hall caught his ear. It was Silas, low and tense. Elias stepped to the doorway just as Clara pushed it open from the other side, striding in with a slim, leather-bound ledger in her hand. She crossed to his desk without asking and set it down with a soft thud. Silas followed, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You've got no business poking around in the boss's records," he growled. Clara didn't even glance up. "On the contrary, Mr. Gage, I think the bride of the man whose herd you've been stealing from has every right to look at his books." Silas's face darkened, but before he could speak, she opened the ledger and began to read aloud, her voice crisp. April 14th, sold 22 head in Cheyenne, reported 16. April 28th, sold 18 head to a mining camp, reported 12. May... "Shut your mouth," Silas snapped, stepping forward. His eyes flicked to Elias, perhaps hoping for backup. But Elias only said, "Is it true?" Silas hesitated a heartbeat too long. "I got debts," he muttered. "You weren't watching close and you thought I wouldn't notice," Clara cut in smoothly. "You're right. I'm not the one who noticed. I'm the one who documented it." Silas's gaze slid over her, slow and mean. All this fire from a fat woman whose daddy had to pay someone to take her off his hands. The words hung in the air, sharp as barbed wire. Elias braced for her to flinch. Instead, Clara rose to her full height, her expression cool, her voice dropping low. "Mr. Gage, you're making two mistakes," she said. "First, you're confusing my size with my strength. Second, you're assuming I came here alone." On her last word, 3 sets of boot steps sounded from the porch. The door swung open to reveal 3 men stepping inside, strangers to Elias, but clearly not to Clara. The first was tall and rangy, with a Colt tied low on his thigh. The second carried a Winchester like it was part of his arm. The third, a broad-shouldered giant with knuckles like iron, moved to block the door. Silas's hand twitched toward his belt, but the big man shook his head slowly. "Don't," he said almost kindly. Elias felt something shift inside him. Not just surprise at Clara's preparedness, but a grudging respect for the way she'd turned the room in her favor without raising her voice. Silas swallowed hard. "What do you want?" "Return what you stole," Clara said, "or the sheriff will have this ledger in his hands by morning." Silas's eyes darted between them, calculation warring with anger. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and backed toward the door, the big man shadowing his every step. When they were gone, Elias shut the door and faced her. "Who are you, Clara?" She set the ledger down, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. "I'm the daughter of a man who's made more enemies than friends. My father has been working with Cormac Drayton for months. Drayton wants your water rights. My father," she hesitated, her gaze steady, "my father agreed to help him get them one way or another, including killing you if it came to it." The lamp hissed softly, its light gilding the planes of her face. Elias felt the room tilt. "Why tell me this now?" "Because once Drayton sets his mind to something, there's no such thing as later," she said quietly. "And because I'd rather stand beside a man in a fair fight than watch him get cut down without knowing why." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint rattle of wind at the shutters. Elias realized his pulse had slowed, not from ease, but from the steadying certainty that whatever she was, this woman wasn't here to run. He reached across the desk, pushing the ledger toward her. "Looks like we're in the same fight now." Clara's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's make sure we win it." The storm of that night's confrontation had passed, leaving the house in a hush broken only by the faint pop of cooling timbers. The 3 men Clara had brought with her were posted outside, their silhouettes shifting in the lamplight from the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote gave a long, lonely call. Elias stood in the doorway of his late mother's sewing room, one of the few spaces in the house untouched by the rough hands of ranch work. He hadn't stepped inside for months, Dust lay on the shelves where folded quilts and scraps of patterned cloth waited, as though she might walk back in to finish a project. On the top shelf, wrapped in a strip of faded calico, was the thing he'd been looking for. When he returned to the kitchen, Clara was sitting at the table with her back straight, her hands folded on the wood, as if she were a guest waiting to be called upon. Her eyes met his, calm but watchful. "I've got something for you," Elias said, setting the bundle down in front of her. She hesitated, then unwrapped the fabric. Inside lay a knife, slim but solid, the handle of polished silver engraved with curling vines. The steel blade had been honed to a fine edge, and even in the warm light of the kitchen it caught a cold glint. "It was my mother's," he said. She kept it in her apron pocket whenever she worked alone, for cutting cloth, and for other things, if the need ever came. Clara's fingers traced the engraving. "It's beautiful. It's more than that," Elias said. "It's a tool, a weapon if it has to be. I've kept it because it was hers, and because it reminded me that being ready isn't about being afraid. It's about knowing you can handle what comes." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was a softness in her expression that wasn't guarded. "Why give it to me?" "Because I trust you," he said simply, "and because you've got a way of walking into storms most men would ride around. That deserves more than words." Something shifted in her posture. She lifted the knife and, without hesitation, slid it into the belt at her waist, where it would be easy to reach. The act was quiet, unceremonious, but it carried the weight of a declaration. She wasn't hiding anymore. "I'll take care of it," she said. "You'd better," he replied, though his voice held no edge. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't strain. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sage and dry earth through the open window. For Elias, it felt like the first moment of solid ground since the day had begun, a strange thing to find in the company of a woman he'd been forced to marry. And yet, here it was. When she finally rose, the knife's silver handle flashed at her hip as she passed him, and he knew the image would stick with him. Clara Dawson, head high, armed not just with steel, but with her own unshakable resolve. The night settled over the ranch in a hush, the kind that made every small sound carry. Elias was in the front room, oil lamp low, when the first sharp crack split the quiet. A rifle shot, close enough to rattle the glass chimney of the lamp. Before he could move, the second came, and with it the smell of smoke. Clara burst through the doorway, the silver-handled knife at her belt and a pistol in her hand. "They've set the porch alight," she said, her voice tight but steady. "It's Drayton's men, and Silas is with them." Elias's blood ran cold. "How many?" "Half a dozen, maybe more, and they're not here to scare us." The window shuddered as more gunfire tore through the walls, splinters raining onto the floor. Smoke was already curling along the ceiling. Elias grabbed his rifle and 2 boxes of ammunition from the cabinet. "The root cellar," he said. "There's a tunnel to the barn, old but it'll hold." They ducked into the kitchen, the heat from the porch fire pressing through the walls. The cellar door groaned as Elias wrenched it open, and they climbed down into the cool dark. The air was thick with earth and the faint scent of onions from the storage bins. Clara followed without hesitation, her boots finding the rungs with practiced surety. The tunnel was narrow, braced with old timbers that creaked under their weight. Elias went first, his rifle slung across his back, the faint glow of the barn's lantern ahead. Behind them, the roar of the fire was muffled, but the popping of collapsing boards told him the house was losing the fight. When they emerged into the barn, the 3 men Clara had brought, Hank, Levi, and Cole, were already there, guns in hand. Hank's arm was in a makeshift sling, but his eyes were sharp. "They've got the yard surrounded," Levi said. "If we stay holed up, they'll burn this down too." Clara moved to a corner, pulling a rolled oilcloth from her satchel. She spread it across a hay bale, revealing a map covered in red ink and official seals. Elias's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "The real railroad survey," she said. "Drayton thinks the line will cut through your ranch. It won't. It's planned for 3 miles south. Without your water rights, that route is worthless. Everything he's done is built on the wrong information." Elias stared at the map, realization hitting hard. Then this is about more than just the land. It's about making sure we don't live to tell anyone what's true, Clara said, rolling the map back up. The sound of boots crunching gravel outside snapped them back to the moment. Shapes moved in the dark beyond the barn doors, the flicker of torches throwing long shadows. Elias's mind worked fast. Water troughs, he said, jerking his head toward the row along the side of the barn. Tip them. Make a slick patch. Levi, cover the east door. Cole, you and Hank keep the front clear. Clara. I'm not hiding, she said, loading her pistol. He gave a curt nod. Then you're with me. They moved fast, the slosh of gallons spilling onto packed dirt mingling with the low murmur of approaching voices. The first of Drayton's men burst through the east door, slipping hard as the wet earth gave way beneath him. Levi's rifle barked, sending the man sprawling back into the dark. At the front, Hank and Cole fired in tight rhythm, keeping the riders pinned behind the corral fence. Elias and Clara took the side window, picking targets through the drifting smoke. Her aim was steady, each shot deliberate. A torch sailed through the air toward the barn wall, but hissed out in the wet patch before it could catch. The smell of charred pitch mixed with the acrid tang of black powder. For 20 long minutes, the gunfire rattled the boards, answering back in sharp cracks from inside. Finally, a sharp whistle cut through the night, and the riders began to pull back. Silas's voice carried on the wind. You can't hole up forever, McKenna. We'll be back, and next time you won't see us coming. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the ragged breathing of the defenders and the low groan of the barn settling back into stillness. Elias lowered his rifle, sweat cooling on his skin despite the lingering heat of the fight. Clara stood beside him, hair loose around her face, the silver handle of the knife glinting at her hip. They'll be back, she said. He nodded. Then we'll be ready. The next morning broke under a sky the color of hammered steel. The air was cool, but there was no peace in it. Elias was in the yard with Hank, checking the damage from the night before, when a dust cloud appeared on the east ridge. Within minutes, riders emerged, Cormac Drayton at the lead, Silas at his flank, and half a dozen armed men trailing behind. Elias's father, Samuel McKenna, stepped out from the barn, his face pale but set. Drayton reined in, his horse stamping and tossing its head. Samuel, Drayton called, his voice smooth as oiled leather. I hear your boys had a rough night. Shame if it all ends with a fire sale. Sign over the deed, and I might just let you and him ride out with your lives. Samuel's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Elias's fingers twitched near his rifle. Before either man could speak, Clara stepped out from the barn, skirts brushing the dirt, the silver-handled knife flashing at her hip. In her hands, she held a rolled document bound with red ribbon. Before you start counting your spoils, Mr. Drayton, she said, her voice carrying clear over the yard, you might want to see the truth of the land you've been trying to steal. Drayton's eyes narrowed. And what would that be? Clara unrolled the parchment, revealing the official territorial seals. The real railroad survey, she said, signed by the commissioner himself. Your grand plan hinges on a false route. The line won't touch this ranch. Without our water rights, your investment's worth less than dust. For the first time, Drayton's confidence faltered. Where did you? But the rest of his words were drowned by the sound of hoofbeats from the south. 6 riders swept into the yard, their long coats parting just enough to flash the badges pinned to their chests. The lead man, a broad-shouldered marshal with a weathered face, spoke in a voice that brooked no argument. Cormac Drayton, Silas Gage, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft, and attempted unlawful seizure of property. Drayton's hand twitched toward his holster, but 3 rifles leveled at his chest froze him in place. Silas spat in the dirt but didn't resist as 2 marshals dismounted to bind his wrists. How long have you known? Elias asked quietly, stepping to Clara's side. 3 days, she replied. I sent word to the marshals the moment I confirmed my father's dealings with Drayton. I just needed you to trust me long enough to see it through. In the next half hour, Drayton, Silas, and the rest of the hired guns were loaded into a prison wagon, bound for Cheyenne under heavy guard. The yard felt different with them gone, quieter, but in a way that spoke of something settled rather than something waiting to strike. One of the marshals handed Elias a folded document. "Your name's cleared. Debts tied to Drayton's scheme are void by court order. You've got your land, Mr. McKenna. Use it well." Elias looked at Clara, the weight of the paper in his hands nothing compared to the weight of what she'd done. "Seems I owe you more than I can pay." She gave a small smile. "Just keep the water running, Elias. The rest will follow." 6 months later, the land looked different. Winter had passed with just enough snow to ease the drought, and now, under a soft spring sun, the fields were dotted with new grass and the promise of grazing herds. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. Down in the south pasture, where the dry creek once lay bare, men were working, swinging hammers, hauling timbers, and laying track. The air was filled with the ring of steel on steel, the bark of foremen calling orders, and the deep rumble of wagons loaded with supplies. The new railroad station was taking shape, a stout, timbered building with wide eaves and a raised platform that would one day receive passengers and freight from as far east as Chicago and as far west as the Pacific coast. Just beyond it, fresh rails gleamed in the sun, stretching like silver threads toward the horizon. Elias stood on the rise above the site, his hands resting lightly on his hips. The work below was a kind of music to him, a rhythm that spoke of progress earned, not stolen. He felt the warmth of another presence at his side before he heard her voice. "They're moving faster than I thought," Clara said, her tone approving. She wore a sturdy riding skirt, her hair bound back against the breeze, and at her belt, the silver-handled knife caught the sunlight. Elias smiled faintly. "Guess that's what happens when the right folks own the water rights." Her eyes sparkled. "And when they're willing to share them at a fair price." Over the past months, they'd worked side by side, negotiating with the railroad company, setting up agreements with neighboring ranches, and rebuilding the main house. The old wounds, both on the land and between them, had healed into something solid. She was no longer the stranger he'd been forced to marry, and he was no longer the man who judged her on sight. "Never thought I'd see this day," Elias admitted, watching a team of workers raise a section of wall. "I did," Clara said simply. "The first day I walked down that church aisle, I knew there was more here than debts and drought. You just didn't see it yet." He glanced at her, catching the curve of her smile. "And you knew I'd come around?" "I knew you'd have to," she replied. "A man can't outrun the truth forever. And the truth is you care about this land and the people on it more than you ever cared about your pride." For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, the wind carrying the scents of sawdust and turned earth. Elias thought of all the nights they'd planned by lamplight, the long rides to settle disputes, the stubborn arguments that had ended in grudging laughter. What they'd built together was more than a business. It was a life. He turned toward her, his voice low but certain. "The dust will always settle, but what you stand for, that's what stays." Clara's eyes softened. "Then we'd better make sure we're standing for the right things." Below them, the sound of a steam whistle echoed across the valley as a small work train rolled in with fresh ties and rails. Workers waved to Elias and Clara on the hill, and she lifted her hand in return. It wasn't lost on Elias that 6 months ago, the land they stood on had nearly been lost, burned, stolen, or signed away under threat. Now it was becoming a hub that would breathe new life into the whole region, and it was because they'd chosen to fight together, not against each other. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose, Elias felt the weight of the years ahead, not as a burden, but as a promise. There would be dry seasons and hard bargains yet to come, but there would also be days like this, when the wind was clean, the land was theirs, and the future lay open as the Wyoming sky. Clara stepped a little closer, her shoulder brushing his. "Ready to head back?" "In a minute," he said, not taking his eyes off the work below. "I just want to see them set that last beam for the platform." She followed his gaze, and together they watched the crew haul the timber into place, the station's bones standing proud against the horizon. Whatever had brought them to this point, a forced marriage, betrayal, fire, and gunfire. It had led here to a partnership built on trust, grit, and the kind of love that could stand the roughest weather. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.